Everyone,
Wow.
so
For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brianna Fitzpatrick. I'm the UN representative for Caritas Internationalis. And it is such a pleasure to welcome you here to the UN Church Center. We're just on the 10th floor here, and we're so lucky to have this second floor space to be able to welcome you all and to be able to spend time in fellowship. I was just saying to someone that since the pandemic, it's hard to get a room full of people because it's so easy to just click the live stream link. But there's nothing like sharing a coffee and fellowship and conversation with your colleagues and new friends as well. So thank you again for being here. I want to, of course, thank the Fordham International Political Economy and Development Program and all of their students who are here. Not only are they wonderful at their academic studies, they also know how to put together lights and live stream and cameras and microphones. And the index that they create every year is something that's incredibly special, I think, not only to the Catholic community, but to the world at large. They've taken Pope Francis's speech at the UN that was given in 2015, pulled facets of it, and created indicators that also include spiritual poverty, something that's not normally measured in global indexes, and have taken that and given you what you see today, and that will be presented later. And of course, we also have our keynote from Miss Julie Ide on the global food crisis and also what we can do about it. And that's such a pertinent facet, not only what the problems are today, but what we're able to do about it as global citizens. But mostly, I think it's important to note that regardless of what part you're most interested in hearing from, or who you're most interested in hearing from today, we're all here because we do know that there are vulnerable people in poverty being left behind by the sustainable, even though we have the sustainable development goals, there are people slipping through the cracks, and those are whom we are called to serve as the Caritas Confederation. If you're not familiar with Caritas, CRS is one of our exemplary members who I'm very grateful to be seconded by to Caritas. And as a confederation, we really are the humanitarian heart of the Catholic Church. We have over 160 members worldwide, serving in over 200 countries and territories. So it's quite a large portfolio for me to cover in the UN office, but I'm inspired by my colleagues in the field every single day. Just yesterday, my colleague Tatiana from Caritas Ukraine was here talking about how they scaled their programs by 5 times and have had 8,000 volunteers since the incursion occurred. And it, like I said, it's just inspiring to hear from people in the field every day. So together, I'm very excited that we get to spend this time together, that we get to also have tons of coffee as well, one of my favorite things in the world, and that we get to also hear from the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the United Nations, Monsignor Robert Murphy, who's going to tell us a little bit more about the World Day of the Poor. But before he does that, I do want to introduce him. I'm going to do a disservice to your CV because you've done so many incredible works with the nunciature so far. But he completed his diplomatic studies in 2007 and has worked in the apostolic nunciatures in Colombia, Argentina, Germany, India, and Nepal, as well as was the private secretary to His Eminence Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Secretary of State of the Holy See. He's been at the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See to the UN since 2022. Actually, I think we were just a month apart in our onboarding. But what's actually most impressive to me as someone who really tries hard to be able to learn the languages of our Confederation members, he speaks English, French, German, Italian, and Spanish. So thank you so much for being here today. And I'm going to pass this over to you.
Well, good morning, everybody. I should start with distinguished delegates, as we do across the road. Ladies and gentlemen, and dear friends, particularly friends, we're all friends here this morning. I'm delighted, really delighted to be with you here this morning at the opening of this event, focusing on the World Day of the Poor, the 7th such day established by Pope Francis. And let me begin by thanking CRS, Catholic Relief Services, Caritas Internationalis, and the IPED, International Political Economy and Development Program at Fordham, for organizing this conference and bringing us together this morning. As Brianna said, it's great in these post-COVID times to come back together in person. It's really important to be together. And today is a good day to be thinking about the things we're going to be discussing, because we celebrate liturgically today Saint Elizabeth of Hungary. She was known for her prayerfulness and her charity, dedicating the latter part of her life to the poor, caring especially for the sick in person. In spite of her high status, she gave everything to the poor. Her example is an example of the sort of action that this day hopes to foster. So the impulse for the Day of the Poor comes from the closing of the extraordinary Jubilee of Mercy. If you remember, back in 2016, His Holiness Pope Francis convoked the Jubilee of Mercy. So to understand where this day comes from, we need to go back to that year, back to November, back to the 33rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. Liturgically, we number the Sundays of the year, and this coming Sunday, day after tomorrow, is the 33rd Sunday of this year. So we go back to the 33rd Sunday in Ordinary Time of 2016. What happened then? Well, it was the closing of the Holy Year. And the closing of the Holy Year is combined with the closing of the Holy Door, the closing of the Holy Door in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and in all the cathedrals around the world. And on that day, Pope Francis decided to close the Year of Mercy by celebrating a solemn Mass in St. Peter's dedicated to the poor and the excluded, the Jubilee of the poor and the excluded, as the last, if you like, note of that Holy Year. And as he delivered his homily, he always has a prepared homily. I'll let you into a secret. The words aren't always prepared by him. He looks at them and then decides whether he wants to deliver them or not. And on this occasion, he delivered some of them, but then, as he tends to, he went off text. And all the most interesting things he says are when he goes a little bit off text. So let me quote a little bit of what he said, some of it from the text, some of it not. Today, in the cathedrals and sanctuaries throughout the world, the doors of mercy are being closed. Let us ask for the grace not to close our eyes to God, who sees us, and to our neighbor, who asks something of us, especially to our brothers and sisters who are forgotten and excluded, to the Lazarus at our door. In the light of these reflections, I would like today to be the day of the poor. And it was those final words that were not in the prepared text. Rather, they came spontaneously from Pope Francis as he looked at the thousands of poor and downcast who had been invited that day into the Basilica and were present there before him. And he'd wanted to meet them, some of them, before that Mass, and they had shared with him their situations, their difficulties and hardships, their hopes, their desires, and that had left a real impression on the Pope. So as he looked up at them from his homily, it came spontaneously from him, I want today to be the day of the poor. And as I think of that, I'm reminded of our Lord, who, as St. Matthew tells us, preaching the kingdom in the cities and villages, was deeply moved when he saw the crowds. He had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. The Pope, in that instinct, shows that he is the shepherd of the flock. He wants to take care of everyone without exception. Now, having worked closely with Pope Francis for a number of years, I know that he is not one to let things lie. Faithful to his training as a Jesuit, he wants to see things done. We might say he's just on the angelic side of impatience. He wants to see words turned into action. And that meant that the very next Sunday, so in the Secretariat of State, where I work, they had to get their act together and do things quicker than they might ordinarily have done. The very next Sunday, he signed an apostolic letter, Misericordia et Misera, and he added at the end words that hadn't been in the original draft. And the idea that he added at the end was this: the World Day of the Poor, a day to help communities and each of the baptized reflect on how poverty is at the very heart of the gospel, and that as long as Lazarus lies at the door of our homes, there can be no justice or social peace. Interesting turn of phrase, social peace, showing how social justice and peace go together. So then, this coming Sunday, 33rd Sunday in Ordinary Time, we will celebrate the 7th World Day of the Poor with a theme taken from the Book of Tobit. Do not turn your face away from anyone who is poor. Well, that title is already a challenge to all of us. And we might well, or indeed we should, ask, how many poor people do we encounter each day? We know that with the passing of time and the progress, the advance of civilization, alas, the numbers of poor seem to increase. They stay with us. Of course, we can't always see poverty. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It can be round about us. It comes in many guises, all vying for our attention. Faces marked by suffering, exclusion, oppression, violence, torture, imprisonment, war, deprivation of freedom and dignity, ignorance, illiteracy, in medical emergencies that cannot be responded to, shortage of work, and the horrors of trafficking and slavery which stay with us and are increasing. People in exile, people who are displaced. Extreme poverty, people who quite literally have nothing. Forced migration, social injustice, loneliness. I could go on with a list, but you get the idea. And all the poor, as Pope Paul VI loved to say, belong to the church by evangelical right and require of us in the church a fundamental option on their behalf. That's what we should be thinking about today. What is our fundamental option on their behalf? Well, as we ponder on this year's title and think of our daily encounter with the poor and those in need, we find ourselves challenged. How can we collectively help to eliminate or at least alleviate exclusion and suffering? What can be done to meet the needs, including the spiritual needs of the poor? We have to start with the realization there's no one-size-fits-all solution. If you buy something that's one-size-fits-all, it never fits properly anyway. One-size-fits-all doesn't work. And that's an acknowledgement that the church has no comprehensive solution to propose. What the church can offer, and that means what we, when we act together as the community of the baptized, can offer with God's grace, is the witness of charity in favor of the poor everywhere, in every time, and in every land. And that's where the Day of the Poor fits in. It fits into that logic. A special day of witness when we take stock of the situation, acknowledge the multifaceted reality of poverty, including our own. I would suggest we begin taking stock of our own poverty before we think any further about the poverty that surrounds us, so that we think about the poverty that surrounds us with a sentiment and an attitude of humility. And from that attitude, we can renew our commitment to work to alleviate poverty around us. Pope Francis returns again and again to the theme of poverty. It's one of the hallmarks of his pontificate. And he highlights, there are various speeches and homilies and reflections he's given, highlighting the first and fundamental beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Poor in spirit, the Pope has noted, are those who recognize that they cannot rely on themselves or remain self-sufficient. They live as beggars before God. They feel their need for him and recognize the good that comes from him as a gift, as a grace. But it's not surprising with those reflections that Pope Francis chose to close the Jubilee year of mercy with a particular focus on the poor and the excluded. Now, this year is also a Jubilee year, not an ecclesial or church Jubilee year. We have to wait a couple more years to 2025 for the next Jubilee year. But it is, in fact, a double Jubilee year. Across the road, we will shortly celebrate 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. While this past April, we celebrated the 60th anniversary of the encyclical Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth. I want to focus, as I close, on the last of those two documents. Why? Well, because Pope Francis, in his message for this 7th day of the poor, takes a great chunk from that encyclical. He quotes verbatim the words of Pope St. John the 23rd. And I think we would do well to listen to them as we ponder our own poverty, the poverty that surrounds us, and think together today what we might do to make a change. Here are the words that Francis quotes. Every human being enjoys the right to life, to bodily integrity, and to the means necessary for the proper development of life, including food, clothing, shelter, medical care, rest, and finally, the necessary social services. In consequence, every individual has the right to be looked after in the event of ill health, disability stemming from work, widowhood, and forced unemployment, as well as in other cases when through no fault of his or her own, he or she is deprived of the means of livelihood. These are powerful words, to which Pope Francis adds, in his inimitable way, a short and simple comment. How much still needs to be done for this to become a reality? Yes, dear friends, how very much. And that involves everyone, from political leaders and legislators through the whole of society, to you and to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much again to Monsignor Murphy for being with us here this morning and for that message. What really resonated with me is the call to advocacy in order for us not to turn our face away from the poor and the vulnerable. Now we will hear from Dr. Schwalbenberg, Babawa Nagwanya, if I said that correctly, yes, and Harrison Yuzepeda, who are going to present the 2023 Pope Francis Global Poverty Index. The trends in global poverty, release of the index, and I just wanted to say to Henry, where is he? Yes. So last night, a few of us from Caritas, CRS, and Fordham had a dinner together with some students. And while everyone went around the table and talked about the clubs they were part of and what work they've done internationally, Henry said, I'm Henry from Fordham, and I'd like to tell you he's a lot more than that. So Henry is a professor of economics at Fordham University, where he also directs Fordham's graduate program in International Political Economy and Development, IPED. He earned both a doctorate in economics and a master's of international affairs from Columbia University, and has published research in the fields of international and development economics, as well as traveled extensively in sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, and Oceania. So again, a lot more than just Henry from Fordham. Of course, he's going to be assisted by students. Babawa is currently earning her MA in economics at Fordham and already holds an MA in international political economy and development from Fordham and an honors bachelor degree from the University of Pretoria in South Africa in economics and statistics. Prior to coming to Fordham, she interned at Vodacom in South Africa. Harrison, Harrison is currently earning his MA in international political economy and development at Fordham as well. As an undergraduate at Drake University, Des Moines in Iowa, he studied international relations and economics. Prior to coming to Fordham, he served as an AmeriCorps volunteer with the American Red Cross and as a Peace Corps volunteer in Morocco. So I'm very excited to hear about the changes from 2022 to 2023 in the report, actually, and for everyone here today to hear about the contents of the report. So I will turn it over to you.
Yeah.
One, two, three.
Ready.
Okay. Hello, my name is Henry Schwabenberg, and as you learned from Brianna, I'm a professor of economics at Fordham, and I am also the editor of this report that we're going to summarize for you briefly. Joining me today is Babawa Magwanya and Harrison U. Zepeda, and both of them were graduate assistants who worked on this project. And as you know, Babawa is from South Africa, where she liked to study economics and statistics, and then got some kind of fancy scholarship to come here and keep us company. And Harrison, were you doing Peace Corps first and then AmeriCorps, or were you affected by COVID?
Right, yes.
And then had a transfer to AmeriCorps. So he was doing Peace Corps in Morocco and then ended up in AmeriCorps. And then we gave you a scholarship too, right? Yeah. They're both very bright. I want to thank Brianna for the wonderful introduction. And then a special thank you to Caritas and to Catholic Relief Services for sponsoring this UN side event to commemorate Pope Francis's World Day of the Poor. And finally, we want to thank Monsignor Murphy for representing the Holy See, and Addison, who is somewhere, is gonna, oh, we don't have a little bag for it, huh? That's okay. We're gonna present you with a copy so you can present it to the Pope the next time you bump into him in St. Peter's. So let us begin our presentation. The main result of this year's report is that extreme poverty in the world may be starting to recover from the effects of the COVID pandemic. Unfortunately, we are still observing high levels of government restrictions on religious freedoms, increasing numbers of adults who are illiterate, rising gender inequities, and a particular concern, which will be the topic of our keynote speaker, an accelerating decline in the global poor's access to food.
Our measure of extreme global poverty is based on the Second Vatican Council.
Do this and I'll work this one.
Our measure of extreme global poverty is based on the Second Vatican Council's concept of human integral development, as drawn from the writings of Pope Paul VI and his friend, the philosopher Jacques Maritain. Human integral development argues that to live a whole, integrated, and dignified life, humans need a range of both material goods and spiritual freedoms. Based on this concept, Pope Francis, when he visited the United Nations in 2015, suggested that to understand extreme global poverty, we need to track 7 important indicators. 4 of these indicators were access to very basic material goods that we need to survive and live: water, food, and employment. The remaining 3 of these indicators were critical spiritual freedoms, non-tangible goods, that we need in order to guide our lives: education, civil liberties, and religious freedom.
Following his suggestions, we have developed Fordham's Pope Francis Global Poverty Index, which has proven to be a unique measure of human well-being because of its focus on both extreme material poverty and the lack of critical spiritual freedoms. This morning, we will review the different components of the Fordham Francis Index and then conclude with the determination of the global poverty gap for 2023. Babalwa will begin our review of the different components of the Fordham Francis Index by looking at what might be the most fundamental physical human need we have: access to water.
On the global monitoring program of the World Health Organization, we found data on the percentage of a nation's population that cannot obtain drinking water from an improved source, such as a well, within a 30-minute period. Looking at the graph projected on the screen, we can see that the number of people lacking access to water has consistently declined from 2013 to 2022. Still, based on the most recently available data, roughly 9% of the world's population, or under 750 million people, lack basic access to water. Harrison will now look at the other fundamental physical need we track in the Fordham Francis Index: access to food.
The UN Food and Agricultural Organization produces data on the percentage of a country's population who are continuously unable to consume enough food to meet their dietary energy requirements. You can see on the graph that recently we have not made much progress on reducing food insecurity. And after 2017, the number of people suffering from undernourishment began to increase at an increasing rate. Probable causes include COVID, conflict, and climate change. Many are concerned that this trend will worsen as we look to the future. For the most recent year of data, about 9% of the world's population lack basic access to food. This means that just under 750 million people are continuously undernourished. Since the human person is also a social being, we have social needs in addition to our physical needs. Babalwa will now describe one of the most foundational social goods needed to sustain families: access to housing.
We obtained our data on inadequate housing from the Oxford and Human Development Initiative. Housing is defined as inadequate if flooring consists of dirt or dung, or if walls and roofs are missing, or if walls or roofs are made from discarded materials such as cardboard or plastics. As you can see, the graph indicates a significant decline in inadequate housing. Much of this decline is due to changes in the data reported by just one country, India. India's previous demographic and health survey conducted in 2015-2016 reported that the percentage of inadequate housing was 24%. The most recent survey of 2019 to 2021, however, reports that the percentage of inadequate housing in India had declined drastically to 14%. We remain skeptical of such a dramatic change. Nonetheless, according to the most recently available data, which may be an understatement, nearly 18% of the world's population, or just over 1 1/3 of a billion people, live in inadequate housing. Harrison will now look at employment, perhaps the most foundational source of good needed to sustain community.
Using data from the International Labor Organization, we calculated the distressed labor rate. The distressed labor rate includes the percentage of a labor force that is either unemployed or employed with a wage of $3.20 per day or less. Without outside assistance, the lives of workers earning $3.20 per day or less are considered to be at risk by the International Labor Organization. In the graph before you, you can see that since 2013, the situation has continuously improved until the outbreak of the pandemic in 2020. We have largely, but not completely, returned to the pre-COVID level of employment. As of last year, 2022, about 22% of the world's labor force, or just over 3/4 billion people, were unable to meet their basic livelihood needs through employment. Dr. S. will now summarize our material welfare indicators.
Looking at the maps being displayed, please note that the dark areas, which show where the lack of access to basic material needs are most extreme, are highly concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, Afghanistan, and Venezuela, and I believe Haiti, but the map is probably, you can't see Haiti on it. Our key takeaways on the positive side are A, basic access to drinking water continues to improve. B, while we are skeptical about some of the data, there is evidence indicating better access to housing. And C, employment prospects for the poor continue to recover from the COVID shock. On the negative side, however, we are very concerned about the accelerating decline in the poor's access to food. In addition to material needs, we are equally concerned about spiritual freedoms. In the classical tradition, the human spirit consists of the intellect, the will, and the conscience. Babawa will now begin our review of spiritual freedoms with respect to the intellect by looking at basic education and in particular literacy, needed to empower the poor to know and understand their own situations.
From UNESCO, we obtained data on the adult illiteracy rate. The adult illiteracy rate is the percentage of a population above the age of 15 who cannot read, write, or understand a simple statement about their ordinary life. Looking at the graph before you, you can see that for the most part, 2013 to 2020, the global illiteracy rate has declined. But in the most recent year, 2021, we see a significant increase in the number of adults who are illiterate. Perhaps we are now observing the damaging effect of the pandemic on basic education. For the most recent data available, about 13% of the world's population, or roughly 750 million people, are illiterate. Harrison will now continue our review of human freedoms with respect to free will. Without civil liberties, the poor's desire to choose, the poor's desire and will to choose what is good for themselves and their loved ones will only be trampled upon. With civil liberty, we focused is gender equity, which by definition can affect up to half of the world's population.
Our data on gender equity come from the World Economic Forum and their Health and Survival Index. The Health and Survival Index measures the gap between the expected healthy lifespan of females versus males, as well as the sex ratio at birth to capture the phenomenon of missing women. It could be considered as a proxy for femicide. On the graph, there was an initial reduction in the gender gap in 2014, but since that time, the health and survival situation of women relative to men has continued to deteriorate. In 2022, it has become much worse than what it was in 2014. We estimate that roughly half of the world's female population, roughly 2 billion people, live in countries where the risk to their health and survival is severe. Babawa will now complete our review of human freedoms with respect to freedom of conscience by looking at the last spiritual freedom suggested by Pope Francis, religious freedom. Religious freedom is one of the rights enumerated in the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Religious freedom should help us form a conscience that can perceive what is right and empower us to do it.
Our data on religious freedom comes from the Pew Research Center and the Government Restrictions Index. The government restrictions index is a combination of 20 measures, such as bans on particular faiths or preferential treatment to one or more religious groups. Here in the row before us, you will see that starting in 2017, the world experienced a significant increase in religious restrictions. We estimate that more than half of the world's population, about 4.5 billion people, live in countries where religious freedom is highly restricted. Harrison will now summarize our spiritual freedom indicators.
Looking at the maps, you can see that the dark areas, which show where the lack of spiritual freedoms are most extreme, are concentrated in North Africa and Asia. Our key takeaways are: A, recent progress against illiteracy may have been reversed by the pandemic. B, the health and survival rate of women continues to deteriorate. And C, government restrictions against religious freedom remain high. I'll conclude our presentation.
In the Fordham Process Index, we measured 7 dimensions of human well-being that respect the dignity of the poor and empower them to transform their lives and communities. 4 are some of the most basic material needs, such as water and food for survival, plus adequate housing to support their families and above subsistence level employment so they can contribute their talents to the wider community in a dignified manner. Of equal importance are 3 critical spiritual freedoms: education to empower the poor to use their intellects to better understand their situations, civil liberties to free the poor to follow their will to choose what is good for themselves and their loved ones, and religious freedom so they are free to search for meaning, form their consciences, and do what is right. Based on the most recently available data, we found that serious gaps exist in all 7 dimensions, as you can see from this diagram. At the lowest end are water and food at 9%, and at the highest end, or the largest gaps, are religious freedom and gender equity at above, it's like 43 and 45, but my eyesight can't see that far. The average of all 7 gaps is the global poverty gap. Based on the latest available data, the global poverty gap is currently 26.0%. So we did not update this chart, did we? So there was new data that came out from Oxford. Oxford does the data on housing. Oxford, was it Human Development and Oxford Poverty Initiative, I believe it is. And the problem was this data that we got from India. And it said originally, the previous said about 25% of the housing stock was inadequate. And then I think they made a mistake and they said 1% only. And then they just revised that to about 11%. But from 25 to 11 is a big improvement. I think we have to investigate a little more to see if it's a real improvement or if they just changed how they're measuring things, to be determined. But if you use the new numbers, instead of this, I think India is a large country, so it has an effect on overall numbers, just like China does. And so this should be, instead of 25.6, it should just be 26. And the conclusion of this is that here's the pandemic, 2020, and things got worse, stayed worse, got even worse. So last year was the worst of them all. And this year is either about the same or maybe a little less. So that gives us hope that we're at a turning point and that hopefully next year we'll see more improvement. And maybe we can get back to eventually back to the levels before COVID and then keep on going down. Let me just conclude. So the world therefore may be just starting to rebound from the negative effects of the COVID pandemic. For the most recent data available in 2023, we were able to observe improvements in the access to both water and housing. We also observed an almost complete recovery in employment from the COVID shock. On the other hand, we are concerned about the continued high levels of government restrictions on religious freedoms, the decline in literacy, and rising gender inequity. We are particularly concerned about the accelerating decline in the poor's access to food.
So at this time, we welcome your questions and critiques. And if you're joining us on the live stream, please add your questions on the chat box. And if time does not allow, please feel free to see us during the break or over lunch, or you can email us at ipad@fordham.edu. Thank you.
Since we're running a little late, maybe we should just do 3 questions. So 3 questions if. Or you should talk into the microphone because if there's people online, they won't be able to hear you.
Thank you. I'm David Yamego from Villanova University. It's a little bit of critique. You mentioned it, but I would like to emphasize a little bit more on it when you were talking about how the data are, how we are measuring all those data. Because when I was looking at the numbers for access to water, that's what I'm doing. I'm focusing on sustainable engineering and more into access to wash for developing countries. A study that I did, or we did in Ghana, even in Madagascar, we saw that hand pumps, when they built them for the first year, all of them are working. Go back a year later, 42% of them are no more working. So depending on when you took those data, when I'm looking at 2022, if I measure the data right after building a pump or something like that, yes, we have good numbers. But if I go back 2 or 3 years later, I'm not sure I'm gonna get the same numbers. So M&E matters. And I think that's one of the reasons why, the MGDs failed, if we can say that, because when we were defining access to water, I have some pictures in 2008 when we were defining access to water in Madagascar. I show you people having pipe of water, but in the condition that you won't drink it, but they were mentioning it as having access to water. So those are things that in our work we have to consider. Thank you.
I should just highlight that Villanova is well known for their work in water, coming out of the engineering school, I believe, right? And so they've been doing this all over the world, I think for many, many years. I don't know how many, but for many, many years. And as you said, a major problem with access to water is maintaining it and so on. Oh, 2 more questions we got time for, I think.
Hello. Hi, my name is Ryan. I'm from St. John University here in New York. I just had a question about the data done for the gender aspect of everything. I saw with some of the years, like in 2019, there's seemed to be nothing there. I was just curious if there were any reason to why, or...
Yeah, I think that's an easy one to answer, COVID.
Okay.
So you gather you don't get the data for 2019 in 2019, you collect it the year after. And so this is coming out of the economic, what's it called? The World Economic Forum. And so they probably just couldn't manage it.
Yeah, I wanted to...
Which makes you think a little bit, because that means those people are very honest, because they said, we don't think we are able to do it correctly because we're not able to function well during this period, so we're not going to report anything. But that makes you suspicious of other people who did report things.
Yeah, no, yeah, I just wanted to make sure. Obviously, it was like after in 2020, but yeah, thank you.
There's a gap. There's no data for that year. And then the last question. Oh.
Hi, I'm Jacob from Northwestern University. I'd like to know what caused a huge jump between 2016 and 2017 in the religious freedom index. How it wasn't quite significantly from 3,000 to almost 4,500 now. what that protocol have? Like,
Yeah, I
what
think that's
policies?
one particular country. And is that?
Yeah, so I was the one who actually.
Thank you.
So I was the one who actually collected the data for this, and that has to do with with crackdowns on religious minorities in China and in India. That happened between those, so obviously those two are like 40-something% of the world's population. And so because of those crackdowns causing those numbers to get a lot worse, that put the number of people living in those kinds of countries way up.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your questions. We have a break until, we have 10 minutes. Oh, let me turn it over to the boss and we'll get out of the way. But we will be around.
I just wanted to make sure that we gave them a huge round of applause for the work that they did. Hi, before we take a break, how many people consider themselves good listeners and happen to be on time for everything? Hands? Okay, no hands, which means I'm gonna tell you you have until 11, and I'll expect you back here in your seats by 11:05, okay? Thank you. Postgraduate experience, managing projects in developing countries around the world, and advancing policy issues pertaining to security, poverty alleviation, health, and nutrition. As the current Global Technical Director for Agriculture and Livelihoods at Catholic Relief Services, she leads 13 global technical advisors and 7 regional technical recovery and resilience, sustainable landscapes, markets and value chains, financial inclusion, and capacity building. She also co-leads CRS's Global Food Crisis Strategic Framework, a learning agenda, external engagements, and thought leadership plans. Very importantly, as well, as we remember not to turn our face, we're also going to learn how we can advocate and do something about the current issues we're facing. So everyone, please give a warm welcome to Julie.
So testing, so everybody can hear me? Okay, great. And thank you, Brianna. And I'd also like to thank Fordham University and Caritas, as well as my colleagues at CRS for inviting me to be with all of you today. I feel very privileged and humbled to join in the launching of the Fordham Francis Index report this year, but also to be with all of you, because especially for those of you who are students or just starting out in your professional careers, you are really our next generation of doers and thinkers and leaders. And as many of you know, we are facing unprecedented challenges in our world today, and we really need you. We need fresh perspectives on how can we think differently, work differently, and really live differently. And I know this can be a little overwhelming. I have a daughter who's just behind you in her 2nd year of college, and she keeps coming back to this question of, what am I going to do? What's my path? Where am I going? And I try to reassure her, as I'm sure others have you, that you don't really need to know right now. That even after graduation, there's going to be 1,000 zigs and zags along the way. For those of us who've been working for years, we're continuing to zig and zag along our path. But the most important thing is to remain rooted in your values and continuously ask yourselves, what is my purpose? And what brings true meaning to my life? Well, Pope Francis talks about the theology of tenderness when he talks about the meaning of life. He says that we're called to pour onto the world the love that we receive from the Lord, to offer it in the church, in the family, in society, to join it in serving and giving ourselves. And he says now, more than ever, we need a revolution of tenderness, and that this will save us. So, how does one bring tenderness to the world stage amidst unprecedented challenges? Let's see. Can you just a little louder? Sure. Uh-oh. Having a little technical difficulty. Okay, so the Fordham Francis report that is being released today tells us that one of the most important areas of concern is related to food And we're seeing, as we've heard, a growing population of people that do not have enough access to food. And this rising spike, this rising spike in food insecurity reveals that we are facing an unprecedented global food crisis. So what makes this crisis unprecedented? Well, for most of us, the most unprecedented thing in our lifetimes has been the pandemic. COVID affected all of our lives. It affected the way we worked, the way all of you studied and went to school, the way we traveled, but most of all in the countries where CRS works, it really affected and had a significant impact on people's livelihoods. So people had less access to money, they had less access to food, and less ability to grow the food that they needed. And we've also seen that the impacts of climate change have increased. And I was recently just living in Southern Africa, where communities are experiencing cyclones almost every year, which was completely unheard of in previous decades. And we see the Horn of Africa that has been trying to grapple with their fourth rainy season with no rain. And we're hearing many stories like this that are showing that our normal patterns of food production are being undermined. And in many cases, entire homesteads and livelihoods are being completely wiped out. Similarly, conflict has revealed how the risks of our interdependent food systems in the world. The war in Ukraine disrupted the supply of grain, and it drove up the price of fertilizer in many of the countries that rely on those global transfers. Conflict in Afghanistan, in Sudan, in the Sahel, and now, of course, the devastating conflict that we're seeing in Israel and Palestine disrupts local and sometimes regional markets. And our food systems just cannot withstand these shocks. So production is affected, transport is disrupted, and the risks for investment go way up. And all of this contributes to a rise in food prices and other prices, and driving the raising inflation that we're seeing across the globe. And as many of us know, for those who live in already very small margins, it becomes very difficult to buy even the basic needs, staple foods, cooking oil, in order to produce food. And even things like paying for families and communities are facing multiple shocks. So they experience one right after the other, which makes it very difficult to recover and puts a further strain on our natural resources. So all of these start to come together in a self-perpetuating cycle that has resulted in 783 million people who are facing hunger, do not have enough food to eat. So 783 million, that's such a high number, it's really quite difficult to grasp. But it's actually more than double the US population. So CRS has the opportunity to hear the stories, to meet the real men and women who are affected by these trends. Well, I don't have a picture of her, but in a couple of years ago, when I was monitoring a flood response in Malawi, that she told me, she talked of how in the middle of the night, she had to grab as much as she could, including her family, came to wash out her entire home and all the maize that she had grown for that year. Can you imagine losing your entire home and your livelihood in one night? And yet when we were talking with her just 1 or 2 months later, she was telling us the story of how she had started to rebuild and her plans for moving on. And at CRS, we witness countless examples of people who are trying to overcome the challenges that they face and working hard to rebuild their lives by growing food for their families, for their communities, and nurturing the land. We also hear of individuals who started a business or their plans for what they want to do in the future. And this is the best part of our work at CRS, that we get to contribute to these journeys. whether it's offering life-saving food assistance to 12 million people just in 1 year through our humanitarian programs, or the privilege of working with over 8 million people. It's a very well, the privilege of working with 8 million people who are working on their farms and trying to strengthen their livelihoods. And 12 million and 8 million, those are also big numbers. And yet they don't come anywhere near the needs that we're facing. So 783 million people require food, are not having enough food. And as we've seen, this number has shot up from 2019, when it was 619 million. That's a big increase. And it's a complete reversal of the trend that we've seen over the last 20 years. We had actually been making progress in combating world hunger. And as the needs arise, the resources that we have to respond to these needs are getting more and more constrained. So our major donor, the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and their Bureau for Humanitarian Affairs, BHA, have signaled a decrease in their budget. So 2 years ago, BHA's budget was $12 billion, and then $11 billion. And now we're expecting a budget of only $7 billion. So the global food crisis, the climate crisis, and the need to strengthen our world food systems so that we can feed the growing world population has been on the main stage of a number of international conferences over the last few months. We had the UN General Assembly right here in New York just a couple months ago, the annual meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and the Norman Borlaug dialogues that took place in Iowa all had a focus on the global food crisis. Even the upcoming UN Climate Change Conference, or as it's called, COP28, is going to focus on food security. Our US Secretary for Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, has said that in previous COPs, the issues of food security and agriculture are kind of sitting at the kids' table. And this year, they're very much at the adult table. So international institutions, national governments, bilateral and multilateral development agencies, corporations and non-governmental organizations are all trying to grapple with the question of how do we respond to this growing crisis, given the impacts and sometimes irreversible impacts that it's having on people's lives as well as our planet. It's kind of like a collective oh crap moment for all of us. And we all recognize that we need to do things differently, but we're still very much in the process of trying to figure out how do we do things differently. So you're not the only ones in the throes of contemplating your purpose amidst great uncertainty. The World Bank is expanding its mandate. It's starting to focus on conflict and food security and climate. The US government is trying to figure out how can we get more resources to local organizations and work more closely with the private sector. And even corporations are no longer just focusing on their bottom line. And they're starting to realize that they have a larger role to play. Just in the last 10 years, many more and more corporations are starting to develop their sustainability strategies and reporting against the triple bottom line. So not just profit, but planet and people. But beyond each organization, trying to figure out what they need to do differently, they work more collectively and do things differently. And these three themes keep rising to the top of those discussions. First, not any one nation or any one organization can respond to the call to action or respond to the demands before us. The need for collaboration and partnerships is stronger than it ever has been before. We all have different strengths and capacities as institutions, and we'll be more effective if we come together, share information, just overcome our competitiveness, even if it's difficult and extremely time-consuming. And that collaboration needs to focus on really strength. So if we have science and technology that's offering solutions that can really move us forward, how can we build those into policies and procedures and not just one-off projects? How can stakeholders be working together to take innovations to scale? Many institutions are working within very short funding cycles of 5 years, sometimes less. We need long-term strategies, long-term funding to address the gaps and weaknesses in the systems that are driving the food insecurity. But if all the collaboration, all the partnerships, and the strongest of systems will still not be enough to address these challenges, if we don't have the right voices around the table, if we aren't fostering and engaging local leadership. So civil society groups and certain nations have been calling for our global financial systems to be reformed from their colonial era formulations so that those who are closest to the problems have access to the resources they need to offer the most appropriate solutions. Oops, little spastic, So, as a first-time participant here in New York just a couple months ago, amid some of the 400 events that were taking place during the UN General Assembly, I have to admit to being a little bit overwhelmed. And it's very paying all this money, flights, hotels, attending fancy receptions. What are we all doing here? What are we going to accomplish? What's our purpose? And perhaps this is why Pope Francis offered these words when he spoke at the 2015 UN General Assembly. Of course, we know, inspiring the Pope Francis Index, he reminded us that it must never be forgotten that above and beyond our plans and programs, we are dealing with real men and women who live, struggle, and suffer, who are often forced to live in great poverty, deprived of all rights. To enable these real men and women to escape from extreme poverty, we must allow them to be dignified agents of their own destiny. Integral human development and the full exercise of human dignity cannot be imposed. They must be built up and allowed to unfold for each individual, for every family, in communion with others, and in a right relationship with all those areas in which human social life develops. So CRS is responding, contributing to the response with our partners to the real men and women who are in need during this global food crisis. And these are some of the worst countries affected by the global food crisis. And as we saw the crisis starting to unfold, we pulled together a working group within CRS. And as Brianna mentioned, we developed a strategy for how we wanted to respond to the global food crisis. And we also asked ourselves, like many others, we contemplated our purpose amidst all this uncertainty. And we recognized that it just wasn't enough. It actually wasn't even feasible to respond to only the immediate humanitarian needs. And we really needed to start to understand within the systems that were driving the food crisis. So we identified 4 systems as what we call leverage points for long-term investment and learning. So we said we need to really strengthen local market systems. We also need to try to scale up restoration of landscapes and ecosystems. We need to develop much stronger data systems, and we need to strengthen governance, especially social protection systems. So we don't have time to go into all of these. I'll just talk about a couple of examples. If you're interested in some things I don't touch on, feel free to ask. We can talk about it later. So sustainable food security relies on strong local markets and reducing that dependency on global markets. But strong local markets don't only help improve our access to food, but they can also contribute to incentivizing education, improving nutrition, and helping families increase their incomes. Education, as we saw, is one of the key indicators as part of the Spiritual Freedom Index of the Ford Francis Report. And the Pope has said that education is the key to helping the poor be dignified agents of their own destiny. So CRS's Food for Education programs, which are funded by the US Department of Agriculture, offer nutritious food in schools to incentivize children to attend school, but this also helps them improve their performance, of course, as well. Here is a picture of Lady and her classmates in a 5th grade classroom in Guatemala. So these students receive eggs to take home to their families to improve nutrition in the household. So here's another student, Julia, who's helping to cook those eggs with her mother. Now, back in the 90s, when these programs started, they relied completely on grains that were shipped in from the US. And that still happens. It's a big part of these programs. But more and more, we've been able to work with and Lillian. And they both produce nutritious foods, which they sell to schools as part of their livelihoods. And the recently passed national school feeding law in Guatemala, 50% of their food from local farmers, like Joaquin and Lillian, can contribute to education, to nutrition, and improving incomes. And just to remind you, employment is also one of the Fordham Francis indicators, indicating the importance of having meaningful work and access to a living income. So we're also excited about a program in Madagascar called the Spices Program, which has been helping farmers to increase their income. And this all started with a vision of a local priest who wanted to use the church land to help farmers learn better agriculture practices, but also to introduce crops that could help them get a bit more money, that were high value crops. So he was introducing crops like vanilla and cacao and pepper. So here you have members of the community who are working in a nursery, one of 20 nurseries that were established through this initiative. They're making these crops available within the community. They're also working with a very interesting multi-story agroforestry model. So they grow high shade trees that are used to protect the productive trees below. They have then the nut trees, the fruit trees like bananas and papayas. Then you have your coffee and your cacao with the vines growing up that grow vanilla and pepper, and even planting pineapple in the ground. So this approach helps improve soil fertility, biodiversity. It helps manage the water better, but it's also offering a more diverse set of food available in the communities to eat, but also for the farmers to sell. So what we also are excited about in this project is that we not only work with farmers at the end of the value chain, which a lot of development projects do, working directly with the farmers. We also work with agro-enterprises that are interested in working with smallholder farmers. So working higher up on the value chain. But by working with these companies to overcome the constraints that they face in the value chain, we increase the opportunities for more farmers to sell their products to these companies. So we are working with a company called Salana. It's a Malagasy company. And they're buying right now 37 metric tons of vanilla from about 11 cooperatives. But they hope as they grow that they'll be able to be buying 90 metric tons of vanilla. So the more they grow, the more farmers they can reach, and those farmers can increase their income. So already this is working a little bit differently and very exciting, but let's go back to our 3 themes. What more are we trying to do? We've had great experience in partnering with agro-enterprises but we're looking for more and more partnerships and collaboration with conservation organizations because of the value of biodiversity that comes with the multi-story agroforestry approach. There'll be opportunities to scale together, working together. We also want to build on the successes and lessons learned in Madagascar and reach out to other countries to build the spices value chain in Africa, Nepal, Central America, and reach out to global companies interested in developing a sustainable Sahanala, we're locally owned and genuinely committed to working with smallholder farmers. So that's one other leverage point focused on landscape restoration. So the way that we manage land is directly linked to the ecosystems that we all depend on, like soil, quality food, and we need water for just about everything. It is fundamental to sustaining human life. In the dry corridor of Central America, the increase of climate change has started to impact and intensify the droughts and dry periods that are experienced, in addition to increasing the intensity of events like hurricanes and cyclones. Makes it very difficult to plant food, to produce food. So just in the last 10 years, about 3 million Central Americans needed food assistance at one time or another because they just simply were not able to grow their crops. So in 2015, CRS introduced an approach called water smart agriculture. And it was just based on the premise of manage your land to manage your water. And so the approach was about introducing very simple principles with farmers of limited water that they were getting. And these were things like always keep your soil covered, minimum tillage or not moving the soil, that really helps keep the moisture in, and things like managing fertilizer a bit better. So we worked with development extension services, government extension services, and universities to promote these principles amongst farmers, but also to measure the impact. And we found that for every $1 that farmers invested in water smart agriculture practices, they increased their income by $2.45. That's almost a 250% return on investment. And during those dry seasons, when other farmers are not able to produce crops, the farmers using water smart agriculture practices are getting an average of a 40% yield increase or more food produced. So I wanted to share with you a picture of a family. Maybe, here we go. The Figueroa, too fast. The Figueroa family here in Honduras. You can see they're in their plantation where they plant maize and beans and bananas. And the head of the family described to us that yes, during the dry season, he's now able to cultivate land, which was simply unheard of previously, because during 6 or 7 months, they're not getting a drop of water. But he said with the program and the practices that he's able to rescue the little water that they do have and secure his family's food supply, which is very significant, but also something that we see in another completely different context, like Malawi. Oh. So in Malawi, we've been working with communities to establish watershed committees. And these committees basically build little stone walls and dig gullies in the landscape to help retain the water, the rain that comes to the landscape. And they're experiencing not only an increase in their water supply supply from natural water sources, but they also did not need food assistance during one of the worst food assistance. So we know that landscape restoration can contribute to long-term food security, and it's much more cost-effective than expensive humanitarian programs. So what are we doing differently to try to spread this message and get the work scaled to a larger extent? We feel we can really work with private sector companies to encourage and influence them. We've also been working and talking with the African Union, who's about to launch their Soils Initiative for Africa. This will mean that all the member states of Africa are policies and regulatory frameworks to promote land restoration and protect the soils. And finally, we're exploring what are the appropriate economic incentives that can be offered in communities that are doing the very hard work of managing landscapes. So I hope with what I've been able to share with you today, I've given you a little glimmer of hope. Not that there's, but that also for you, especially our young members of the audience, that it really doesn't matter whether science is your thing, if you want to be a water engineer, if you want to go into tech or start a business, or maybe do research and teach, or be a diplomat, or start working in international development. All of these roles are really needed, and including other roles as well, so that we're working together to identify solutions. The key thing is this working together, to reach out beyond your disciplines and working with others, learning with others, always challenging the status quo, but with a sense of tenderness, and in the spirit of supporting the real men and women in their quest for integral human development. Thank you. So before we take questions, we are going to jump in to, was it words to action that Monsignor shared with us, this idea from Pope Francis. So we are going to jump into action because we all have the ability when we're in the US to engage in advocacy, to put our voice out there and engage our congressmen, our legislatures in making the decisions that really matter, especially in international development programs. So we've made this easy for you by setting up a system. If you get all your phones out while we wait for the technology to catch up with us. There we go. So if you get your phones out, we're going to offer an opportunity for you to write a letter to your Congress representative and ask them to make the US government a leader in combating poverty and world hunger. And especially in this case, we're asking to support poverty alleviation and humanitarian response programs, especially right now in the Ukraine, that you should always be engaged in advocacy, and there will be other support as well. But if you go to your phone and you type in this number as a phone number, and you type in hunger into your text message, press send, then you will get a link, and that link will offer you that opportunity to write a letter to your congressperson. So you can write in your details. You'll have to write in your details when you connect to that CRS link. And then it'll populate already your congressperson. There's already a sort of formatted letter there, but it's much more effective if you write a bit of personalization to that letter. So add your own personalization. Remembering that you have an opportunity here to really make an impact in a decision that your congressperson is making. And the fact that we're all doing this together is that we're really maximizing that opportunity to make an impact. And then once you write that letter, thinking about for you what's important about the US government contributing to the alleviation of poverty and hunger. And we know we have limited resources. How can we use them most effectively?
And Julie, we're going to ask our university students to push this back on their campuses. I know there's many students that have to do this text.
Yes, thanks, Maureen.
So
when we talk about not turning our face away from the poor, it's where you really have the power to not only send a message yourself as your own voice, but kind of mobilize the voice of your friends and colleagues. All right, so I think we can move on to questions. So if you have any questions or any comments, all are very welcome. I think someone will come around with a microphone.
Thanks. Hello. Hi, my name is Brian Lucci. I'm with Marymount Manhattan College.
Use your mic.
Dr. Jennifer Wheeler.
Just speak up a little bit.
Yeah, no worries. So I was wondering, with the increase in food insecurity and the decrease in funding, I was wondering what your opinion was and how to bridge that gap between idea and action. Personally, how do you feel?
Yeah, so one of the things is that we're trying to get the message out how we can be more strategic about the use of funds that we do have. And identifying where those funds that we do have, hidden corners. So we really need those humanitarian funds that BHA has. And we want to believe that it's not a zero-sum game, that we're not working with the same amount of resources to respond to massive need that's growing. But we're looking to respond to massive, where do those other funds exist? And it's the same idea of corporations, foundations, who else has a stake in this game? Those other corporations getting out of our sort of status quo, and getting out of our sort of status quo, kind of depending on government resources and looking for more creative, but also initiating more of those longer-term systemic solutions, which actually are not as expensive. Responses. So that's really the purpose of our sort of core key leverage. Is trying to convince people of how they can use resources.
Great, thank you. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hello. So we have a question from online. Hello. So we have a question. No, I'm dead. Hello. Okay. So the question is from Chile. She asked. So the question is from Chile. What interventions, if any, are targeted at institution building in countries? Because good systems usually need sustainability.
That's a great question. And when we talk about systems, we realize that really has to be central to almost any program that we have these days. CRS, I would say in the last 10 years, every program we have, we're relating to the particular alignment. Education, whether it's agriculture, whether it's health, and we are trying to work with the ministry to understand what are the bottlenecks, what are the constraints. It's very rarely a real policy issue. It's usually about whether they have the budget, whether they have the staff capacity to implement the policies and make things, move into action. But I want to mention the other leverage point that we mentioned was social protection systems, and that's a critical piece that we see for responding to the demands that keep coming up, these urgent demands. And it's not something CRS has done a lot of already. So it's an area where we want to do things differently. But recognized governments more and more are setting up these social protection or social welfare systems. So they have a systematic way of identifying need and delivering resources that are needed to help the ultra poor graduate out of poverty and have their needs met. So it's those systems that we're really honing in on, especially in responding to the global food crisis.
Hi, my name is Ray Ward. I'm from Carnegie University. I want to thank you very much for your presentation, and people that are new to this. I mean, this is alarming, right? To see that curve that has been going down for so long start to pull back up again is distressing. You know, I love to be able to tell people this is an optimistic time. We're making progress. We've been making progress for the last 40, 50 years, and now to see that trend changing is scary. But I guess I'm going to try to pull in the gender inequality measure here. To see an uptick of 1 or 2% in the water and food measures is alarming, but to see a change from 30 to 50% in gender inequality over the last 3 years is crazy, right? And in our work, in our partnerships, I'm thinking particularly of work we do in Guatemala, we see that when women thrive, communities thrive. And I'm wondering if you're seeing any connection here between the changes in the similarities in gender equality measures and the food or water access work that you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I can say that definitely in my work of agriculture and livelihoods, we spend a lot of time assessing what are the barriers for women to get engaged in, developing a small, medium enterprise or to make sure that their agriculture is productive. And those barriers are still very much out there. And they are very systemic when it comes to access to finance or access to land. When it comes to so there's definitely a correlation between barriers that women are facing in order to sort of, pursue their own dignity and progress. And they're sort of beholden to some of those systemic issues that just haven't changed. So that's what I would see as the link. There's a lot of effort out there as well. A lot of investment banks or investment funds are really focused on women-owned businesses and that type. So there are groups out there that recognize that need and are trying to address. So there are groups out there that probably just need more support.
Hi, I'm Daniel from Fordham University. Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to go back to a comment you made about corporations and the new emerging triple bottom line. Because, well, not to be too cynical, but frankly, as a student of economics, that really goes against the orthodox teaching, shall we say. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on what you've seen in terms of corporations moving towards this conception of a triple bottom line, so to say, and why you think that might be happening and why it might continue to happen, so to say, and why you...
It's a great question. When you talk about getting out of your comfort zone, that's a reality for us right now in the NGO sector is, do we want to be working with corporations? Are we sure that, they really mean what they're saying? But it's almost a non-starter. We have to, but it's that we have to. But it's about identifying the corporations that are really genuine in the sustainability path. And I can really quickly, I'll just touch on an example. We were working with a sugar company owned by a South African company in Malawi. And they had genuinely started working on a 10-year sustainability strategy. They realized that they were in Malawi, they had already been in Malawi for 100 years, and they planned to be in Malawi another 100 years. And they realized that they just couldn't continue operating in the way that they were operating. They needed to look at, they had a whole strategy around thriving communities in their environment and how their massive operation should be contributing to a better life for people that were living in the community surrounding them. And they saw the opportunities to facilitate young people to be engaged in the vendors that they were using. So they were it's not corporate social responsibility. It's looking at their business models, their operations, and their financial flows to really think about how they can connect to the needs of the world. So those corporations are out there. And even within the corporations, there are those early adopters that are the voice sort of trying to convince other people in their corporation that this is really important. And that was the same in the sugar company. But there's a long process of learning how to speak to each other, learning how to understand, our real motivations, and then trying to sort of chart that path forward. One more question.
Hi, my name is Ileana from Marymount Manhattan College. And so I just wanted to ask, because a lot of the issues with food insecurity are very tied to the climate crisis, and a lot of the countries that are facing the worst insecurities are the ones who are also being most affected by this crisis. So for some of the local efforts that you are working on, how do you make them sustainable in such a changing climate that is still very precarious in a lot of these places?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's a lot easier in sort of long-term development programs to engage in these questions of climate and promote the land restoration and climate. We really feel is one of the key aspects to helping communities adapt to the climate crisis. I mean, growing, the sustainability of our landscapes in sort of withstanding floods and preventing droughts is just textbook. It's there in terms of the evidence. But how to get those practices out there, a little bit easier in development programming. But as people are having to respond to crisis, they're in the midst of the humanitarian response to the crises that they're experiencing. So again, one of the things that we're trying to do differently is introduce those practices into even our humanitarian response. So rather than just, go and give the farmers that lost their crops some seed or some fertilizer so they can plant new crops, we integrate into that effort messaging around the importance of some of these climate smart agriculture practices that they can build into their programming already when they're responding to a disaster. So that's sort of the shift, the small shift responding to a disaster, the small shift that we're trying to make in that sense. So I think that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for your questions. I'm happy to talk with you about other things afterwards. I'll hand over to you. I'm happy to talk.
Thanks again to Julie. So there's only a few things that stand between you and lunch now. So there's only a few things. First is to close our live stream, but I ask that when we close our live stream, you stay seated for the next couple instructions I have to give. So thank you to everyone joining us online. If you have any further questions or comments, feel free to reach out to the iPad department, Caritas, or CRS, and we're happy to answer those questions or comments. If we could just close our live stream with another applause of thanks, that'd be great.